Welcome back to every naval battle in history. In this episode, we finally draw a line under the Second Peloponnesian War, better known simply as the Peloponnesian War, between the Spartan and Athenian Empires. When I started this series, I was not expecting the Peloponnesian War to take up so many episodes. It's really been a wild journey of discovery, and I hope you viewers have enjoyed the ride. We started with the Battle of Sybota in 433 BCE, covered in episode 13, and we are finishing nearly 3 decades and 10 episodes later in 405 BCE with the Battle of Aegospotami. Just to reflect for a moment, this war began with Athens miscalculating that they could bully their trade rival Corinth, the two just 44 miles apart. That Corinth's allies, particularly Sparta, stood by them through this epic conflict was the crux of the miscalculation. That Sparta was itching to take Athens down a peg certainly helped. That the vibrant Athenian democracy was an existential threat to the cruel slave-based hierarchy of Sparta was well understood, and the ruling families of Athens frequently had more in common with their Spartan friends than their own citizens. Most observers consider the war was lost in 413 BCE, when the Sicilian expedition ended in complete disaster and the loss of 30,000 trained rowers. Things went beyond catastrophic when the Persian Prince Cyrus started funding a Spartan navy to finally try and cut Athens off from its grain shipments. Still, Athens, through plague, coup, counter-coup, riots, fires, being besieged within the city walls for decades, and the betrayal by long-suffering allies, kept finding new ways to win, and then throw away the victories through recrimination and a failure to value their most talented officers. The thrashing of a dying empire. So let's set the scene for Aegospotami. Having learned the hard way at Argonusae that admiralship is worth at least as much as individual fighting ships, the Spartans record Lysander to command. Their laws still prohibited a navarch from holding the position more than once, so he was technically just an advisor, but it was clear who was in charge. This isn't so different to Themistocles' token subordinate commands of the Athenian forces in the Persian Wars. With Lysander back in charge, the Persian money flowed in once again. The entire tax revenue of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, one of the richest parts of the ancient world, was being flooded into the Spartan navy. A revenue the weird, backwards, feminist, communist slave state of Sparta was totally unable to handle. Killing 2 birds with 1 stone there for the Persians. Lysander ran riot. Lack of funds had been hampering the operations of the Athenian fleet for years. Their lost victory at Argonusae had been won with melted down gold statues of goddesses. Operating within sight of Athens' port Piraeus, he attacked Aegina and Salamis, which drew the Athenian fleet out of its base on the island of Samos. No navy can allow the enemy to sail with impunity within sight of their home port without a response. No longer blocked from the northern Aegean Sea by the Athenians at Samos, Lysander struck north, basing his fleet at Abydos, and then capturing Lampascus, today called Lapseki, in the Bosphorus, right in the narrows linking the Mediterranean and the Black Seas. Just across the narrows, a distance we can still see across today, somewhere on the Gallipoli Peninsula, was Alcibiades' personal castle. It's likely he was able to monitor trade through the Dardanelles from this castle. It's possible he could see Lysander's new fleet from his home. The Athenians could not allow Lysander to sit on top of their grain supply route from the Black Sea colonies. With the city of Athens bottled up by Spartan raiding inside their long walls, all food had to come by sea, partly from Egypt, but crucially through the narrows of the Dardanelles. The pursuing fleet under Conon set up at Cestus and then moved north to Aegospotami, where a creek runs into the strait, just 4 kilometres from the Spartan base. The beach was not well set up to base a large fleet from, nearly 180 ships. I'm guessing the creek was an inadequate source of fresh water. Certainly today, viewed on Google Street View, I would not want to be watering thousands of oarsmen from this creek. This picture is from where the road crosses the creek and is less than 700 metres from where it enters the sea. Thanks again to Google Street View, which has proved surprisingly helpful in figuring out ancient naval battles. Every day the Athenians sailed out to challenge Lysander, and every day he declined to fight them. If their material condition was deteriorating, and the grain ships were unable to transit the strait, this was a strong position of tactical defence while being strategically offensive for Lysander. At some point, Alcibiades walked down from his castle and suggested the beach was a terrible base of operations, and they should pull back to Cestus. Some sources claim he also promised to provide a Thracian army if he was given a share of command in the Athenian fleet. His suggestions were declined, and he walked back to his castle to watch the show. Xenophon and Diodorus Siculus have very different accounts of the battle. Diodorus says the Athenians under Philocles tried to lure the Spartans out to attack a weak portion of their fleet with the hope of then counter-ambushing with the main force. This was the third time they'd tried this in just a handful of years. It had worked for Alcibiades at Cyzicus, and it had disastrously not worked at Notium. In this telling, the small force was quickly destroyed, and as at Notium, the main force was not ready to fight and also got slaughtered. Xenophon just says the Athenian fleet sailed home after a day's posturing, sent the sailors out to find some food, and were surprised by a late attack by Lysander's Spartan fleet. Either way, the Athenians managed to get caught on the beach, which was always a disaster in this, or frankly any other era. Just think of the US fleet at Pearl Harbor. Conon escaped with 9 ships, the rest, of a fleet of 180, were destroyed or captured, and 3,000 sailors executed. Conon sent 1 ship to send news to Athens, and took the rest to Cyprus, possibly not willing to be held to account by the murderous Athenian assembly. With no fleet left, Athens starved through a siege and surrendered in March 404 BCE. That same year, Alcibiades was murdered by assassins, possibly sent by Lysander. The Spartans tore down the long walls which had vexed them for 27 years, overthrew the Athenian democracy, and installed an oligarchy of 30 tyrants. The statue Sparta erected to mark the triumph had this inscription: "These men, sailing with Lysander in the swift ships, humbled the might of the city of Kepkrops, and made Lacedaemon of the beautiful choruses, the high city of Hellas." For the next 30 years, Sparta would be the dominant power of the Greek world. The damage done to all sides would set the scene for the Macedonian takeover of Greece, and then the rest of the region. Sparta would get drawn into the Persian dynastic conflict on behalf of their ally Cyrus. The rivers of gold which had financed their fleet would wreak uncontrollable changes on their society and in turn hasten their decline. As usual, the winners of a war are the ones who can avoid getting involved. It is striking that the Athenians could keep sustaining such losses and keep inflicting so many unnecessary disasters on themselves, and yet keep fighting year after year. Also striking that the Spartans could spend decades waving their spears at the Athenians' walls before finally figuring out a path to victory. We do need to be careful with these stories. The sources were not friends of Athenian democracy. On the other hand, if they are even remotely accurate about the madness of the final years, then there is some reason for them to feel that way. These battles of the Peloponnesian War have been a much bigger project than I was expecting when I set out. But it's been a rewarding journey, and I hope you, the viewer, have found it interesting too. This isn't the last we'll hear of Athens and Sparta. Strap in, folks, we've got lots more to cover as we take on every naval battle in history. Smash those like and subscribe buttons, you don't want to get left behind.